Hi, today Heidi Carroll and myself, Kim McGregor, are delighted to have Irene Lyon to talk to. Irene has a master's in science and she's a nervous system expert. She teaches people around the world how to work with the nervous system to transform trauma, heal body and mind, and live full creative lives. To date, Irene's online programs and classes have reached over 9,500 people in over 90 countries. That's pretty impressive. Irene has a master's degree in biomedical and health science and also has a knack for making complex information easy for all of us to understand and apply to our lives. Irene has extensively studied and practices the works of Dr. Moshe Feldenkrais, Peter Levine, founder of Somatic Experiencing, and Kain, founder of Somatic Practice. Irene likes to spend her free time eating delicious food, hiking in the mountains, or walking along the Pacific Ocean in her hometown of Vancouver. Welcome, Irene.
Hello, Kim and Heidi. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
So, Irene, what we're interested in to start with, we believe you've had an interesting foray into Feldenkrais and into the work that you're doing with a link to Australia. Can you describe your journey, please?
Sure. Well, I originally got into, I would call the helping, healing human physiology worlds in university. Right after high school, I was interested in exercise science. Because of an injury I had sustained in high school, skiing, so snow skiing, as you might call it, not water skiing. And that injury led me to become just interested in rehabilitating the body. So I went into exercise science, really loved it, was working in more kind of the gym, fitness, recreation center areas. I was a personal trainer, rehab specialist. Pretty fairly high up there, also in nutrition, sports nutrition. And then I kept injuring myself. I got another knee injury and then another knee injury. Right. And then, and those recovered. But then there was one injury that was really a doozy. That was a complication from one of my ACL repairs, and my patella, my kneecap, broke in half spontaneously one day walking down the stairs at my home. Ouch. It was very painful. It's exactly as they say. It's the most painful bone that I know of that you can break in your body. That then led me on to eventually the Feldenkrais journey, because when I was recovering, even though I was strong and fit and I was in my mid-20s then, everything looked put together. I was in a lot of pain. I was in a lot of tension. I remember one day I was stretching back in the day when I stretched my hamstring, and I felt this and heard this big tear, so I probably tore a bit of my biceps femoris. I'm like, okay, something's not right here. And I was seeing massage, chiro, physio weekly. And I was doing all my exercises in rehab that I had been taught how to do at university, and I was teaching others, and not something wasn't working. So at this time, I was actually in Australia, going to uni at the University of Wollongong, and I was doing a master's degree. And it was at that university that they sure knew me at the gym. I was there for 2 hours a day. I swam at the pool. I had to learn how to swim the other way. I don't know if you know that, but here in North America, like, because of the driving, you turn your laps differently. So I had to, like, everything got kind of turned around. But so I was just active and trying to figure out why I was in so much muscular tension. I was strong, like I was hiking up the mountains and running in the Royal National Park. So what happened was, my physical therapist, Ray Dubber, I still remember his name, it's so crazy. He said, I don't know what's wrong with going on. I want you to see one of my colleagues who's just up the road. His name is Jerry Burns. Can't believe I remember that too. And he is up the road in Thirroul, small town on the coast, so pretty. Go see him. He does this stuff. So I was like, okay. So, I got on a train and I walked up a steep hill and I went to this old place that used to be, I think, a sanitarium. It was very scary and you could feel the ghosts in the hallways, but they had turned it into a rehabilitation center for stroke and physical ailments. And I saw him, and there wasn't even a proper Feldenkrais table. It was like more of treatment medical ward tables. And bear in mind, I had never done anything mind body. Like this was in 2000. And I laid down. I probably fell asleep because I was so tired from grad school and all the rehab I was doing. I don't know really what he did. I know he moved my body around. He didn't ask much of me. And he was also a PT, so he was doing probably some physical therapy stuff. And then he gave me a tape, good old cassette tape. And he said, okay, I want you to do side A tomorrow, wait a day, then do side B, and then wait a day, do side A, B, and come back after you've done that 3 times each side. So I did that. And I won't forget it. I was in my tiny dorm room and I was laying on the ground, probably the size of a single bed, the amount of space I had, popped the tape into my whatever I had to play tapes on. And it was a classic lesson of flexion, just, lifting the head, feeling the weight of the head, pelvis, ribs, blah, 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 crossing over, lifting the head in different ways. And then of course they instruct, now rest, now see what it's like to lift your head. Now see what it's like to feel the weight of your head. And I went to lift my head and I wish I could get that feeling back, because it was the feeling of absolute lightness in my skull. Like it wasn't there and it was so easy. Like I didn't realize at that time how much strain I had been putting into my movement. And so as soon as I felt how light my skull was, something just was like, holy shit, this is really something I should probably focus on. And so it kind of sold me to be very diligent with doing what he said.
Yeah.
And then side B, I think, was like some extension practices. And then I went back to see him. He did some more stuff with my body. I probably fell asleep again. And then he gave me another tape that had some rolling movements in it, and did those. And then after about a month, it's as if everything was gone. Like all the tension was gone. I remember throwing my bike over my back one day and like running up the stairs to my office as if it was nothing. And that also was a very significant, okay, something's really interesting. Because what he said was, I don't want you to do any strength training, don't do any stretching, go for a walk, go for swims, go for your hikes, but don't do anything specific. And I said, okay. And so that was kind of a moment of, there's something here. But then I got busy, went back to my school, finished grad school, fly back to Canada. And it might have been well over a year after I got back that I tweaked my back, I think, at the gym, lifting a weight or something, I don't know. And so I tried to find those tapes and I couldn't find them. They were probably left somewhere or I threw them out. And that time, at that moment, was when Google, I think, was just starting to come alive. And I typed in what I remembered to be the name of the work, which was Feldenkrais. And then I found out that there was a training occurring nearby with Jeff Haller. And that was kind of the beginning. And I just went into it and it was such a fun experience. I learned so much. So that was 2004. So there was a gap of about 3 years, 2 to 3 years, where I think I just kind of left it and then it came back. So that's sort of the entry into the Feldenkrais world initially.
Yep. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So that's your Feldenkrais journey. And then from there,
yeah,
tell us about what happened from
yeah.
there. Yep.
Yeah. So I mean, as soon as I was in my training, I started teaching classes because I was already teaching classes at the fitness center. So I just kind of blended them in. I think I might have called them like I don't even know, right? It was something. And finished my training in 2007. And about a year after, I was working in my studio. So I was building up a following in my hometown that I lived in. It was a small town. Some of the Aussies would know it. It's Whistler, British Columbia. It's where all people come to ski. So I was living and working there for quite a while, and doing really good work. Like I was having really good success with a lot of folks. But then there was a summer in 2008 where I saw a string of people, and there were about 3 to 4 people that came to see me for physical troubles, like one was a frozen shoulder, another was just this chronic tension that they couldn't get rid of. Another woman had been in a propane explosion, so she had burns, or recovering from that, which is pretty tough. One was having back pain. I mean, just lots of similar ailments physically that I used to see, but for some reason, what I was doing with them wasn't working.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what, am I doing something wrong, or am I missing something? Because these other people are getting benefit and it's sticking, right? So why isn't it sticking with some of these people? And I don't know the exact timeline, but somewhere shortly after that, I started asking questions of colleagues. And then that led me to find out about Peter Levine and somatic experiencing. And I started my somatic experiencing training pretty much later that year, because this was summer of 2008. And I started that training, I think, in the fall of 2008, or the winter, our winter of 2009. And then I just dove into that completely, kind of just immersed. And that was like, holy moly, guacamole, like this is really important. And now I understand why these folks weren't ready for the Feldenkraisian way, because their nervous systems were still stuck in a intense dysregulated state, what we might call a trauma response, which is not the most accurate term, but their system was hyped up or completely dissociated and frozen. And so that then led me to go even further into the rabbit holes, learning more intensely with Peter in his master classes, learning with Kathy Kain, because even the SE model is not always enough for those with developmental trauma, early trauma, in utero trauma. And so her work, she's also trained in somatic experiencing, and she's also trained in body work. Her work really taught me the need to work with the cells and the stress organs, and understand that it's actually not the brain that's putting us into these fight-flight responses, it's the physiology and the neurochemistry. And so that was kind of one of the final things I've studied. I probably will keep studying other things, but that kind of gelled everything together. And then in about 2017, I kind of reintroduced Feldenkrais. Not that I personally stopped it, but it just wasn't my focus in my practice. I started reintroducing it via group classes again, and larger workshops, where I was blending the principles of somatic experiencing, for example, with the movement and practice and the principles of Dr. Feldenkrais's work. And when those two came together, it was like a magical good bomb exploded, because I was able to help people settle and feel a bit safer in a class before getting them to do things that are a little more higher brain, which is essentially what Feldenkrais is. So that's kind of the evolution. And then I stopped private practice to bring stuff online. Gosh, like 7 years ago. And thus far, most of my work now is online, not so much by choice, but just that's where things are right now. Hope to get back to teaching workshops soon. I'm going to be starting a professional training, hopefully next year. So there's lots cooking. So that is a Full circle story.
Yeah, look, that's a fascinating journey. I was wondering if you could give us some examples. You talked about, helping people get to the point of, where they're able to settle to do Feldenkrais work. So, with Kain's work and Levine's work, can you give us some examples of things that you are doing or that you do with people to help them get to that stage?
So because each person is different, it's hard to say exactly what. But
Okay.
the first thing, Kim, is education.
Uh-huh.
So, and it's deep education, not just there's a nervous system, there's fight, flight, freeze, there's these nerves. It's really understanding what occurs when there is a threat on the outside. And was that threat insidious growing up? Was that threat in utero, which for many people it was the case? What was the home life like? Was a person even allowed to be in their bodies, let alone express their body? And I think this is that education, which when I teach it in my programs is over 5 hours of education. And that's just scratching this, that's scratching the surface. And then there's an extra 10, 20 hours of training calls that's trying to give my students as much as I can that I learned through my somatic experiencing and somatic practice backgrounds. And the reason why it's important is different kinds of histories will present differently when you're an adult. So someone might be very hypervigilant and very paranoid, that we would call it in the SE community, global high activation. There is this constant thinking that I am going to be attacked. And like we could call it even kind of an ADD-ish, like, that's what essentially ADD and ADHD is. It's this hyper attention to the environment because we're looking for threat. But that threat usually starts, and I'm generalizing here, but somewhere in the home life, or one element that often is not talked about when we talk about trauma is early traumas like birth trauma, surgical interventions when we're infants, dental appointments when we're young, where we're having to be strapped down and held down and we're trying to get away, near drowning, near choking, near death experiences as babies, which happens actually quite a bit, and as kids. And so when a person starts to understand their physiology from that lens, they can start to go, this is why I never want to lay still. This is why it's so hard for me to concentrate when the lessons are really quiet. But give me a big 4 points lesson where there's lots of muscle activation, and I love it because I'm activating my sympathetic muscles to flee and fight. So the beginning education is important because in that a person starts to have recall, right? We call recall when a medical doctor who is good tries to figure out a problem is they'll ask lots of questions that spark their patient's recall of events that they may have forgot about. The other reason why education is important is the flip side of that kind of hyperactive, alert, hypervigilance is what we would classify more as a shutdown, a collapse, depression, lethargic, toxic shame, the sense of worthlessness, no self-agency. Okay, so if a person is in that collapse state and there's not a lot of tone in the muscle, why is that? And you don't want to load that person's system up with the 4 points, for example. You actually have to get them maybe sitting up and just feeling the tiniest movements of their legs and even realizing that they have legs. Because a lot of times these movements are happening, but a person actually isn't even in their body. Right? Because whatever occurred took them out of their body. It doesn't have to always be abuse. It could be that surgical stuff that I mentioned, which is actually quite prominent and people forget about it. So education is like the key thing, Kim, because what happens is because of our higher brains, and if someone is interested, Because if someone's not interested, this isn't going to work. You can't try to force teach education to someone who doesn't want to learn and understand. But when someone does, you start to see these little light bulbs go off. And you start to teach then it's okay if you have to take a break.
Yeah.
It's okay to stand up even though the whole class is laying down, to collect yourself. Because regulation for one person is going to look very different to someone else. Again, someone might need to be a bit more active to feel safe, and others might have to be more quiet. And commanding that in a group class is very interesting, right? And so that's where, like, my perfect scenario is no one comes to class or a workshop unless they've done some base level education and they know how to feel their bodies against the ground, for example. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that was great. So what I'm hearing is the education, which is sort of lighting up your prefrontal cortex, so that then you can start applying that to yourself to then find which way you need to go to then self-manage.
Exactly. And maybe learn how to find self-regulation for the first time.
Yeah.
I would say that I don't know the stats for this, and it would probably be nearly impossible to find them, but not many humans living in Western civilization are fully regulated. Unless they've done a lot and a lot and a lot of work. Even myself, just this last year, I've moved through more layers of my functional freeze that I didn't even know were there. And then poof, there they popped up. So the reason I say that is sometimes when people hear the somatic experiencing work and trauma, they're like, oh, I didn't have trauma, or my parents did the best they. It's like, yes. Your parents did the best they could, and they probably didn't have what they needed when they were little, and their parents certainly didn't have what they needed when they were little. That's not really the fault of anyone, just time, right? And so by teaching someone that your heart rate racing isn't a bad thing, it's just information, it's your system. Of course, if there's a heart condition, that's totally different, right? Or something, or a deficiency in nutrients. But let's just say the person is healthy, they're not deficient in any nutrients or vitamins and minerals, and all of a sudden they have this sweat reaction or something happens, and you want them to know that that might be something old that's coming up. And then that's where you have to make a decision. Okay, we need you to do some groundwork, some base level work to get your system into more capacity, find what we would call a window of tolerance, so that you're not just, to borrow Kathy Kain's term, like white knuckling it through a class. And it doesn't have to be Feldenkrais. The amount of people that I've spoken to who teach yoga, who are in the yoga world, will say, wow, I've been teaching or taking classes and I had no clue that I wasn't actually in my body. Same with meditation, same with breath work. There's a lot of bypass that goes on in our mind-body practices because we just don't realize that we're in this kind of shutdown or hypervigilant state, right?
Yeah. So when you're talking about that, it's really interesting for me about that word trauma, because I think we need to understand that to me, that's one place of education, because for most people it is, oh, I didn't have sexual abuse, I wasn't, or I have, and that's how they're defining their whole experience. Can you expand our education now about what you think trauma is?
Yeah, so in this world of somatic experiencing, somatic practice, these arts and sciences, we would say that trauma is not necessarily the event. It's what's occurring within a person's physiology and autonomic and peripheral nervous system. So it isn't about the event per se, but how that event or many events or that entire lifetime has created a situation, a system, a biochemistry, a behavior pattern that is riddled with what we would call dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, which is like a whole other, and then we could like break that down and what that means. But essentially it's trapped. What I like to use is survival stress. So fight, flight, and freeze. And then freeze has a few more spectrums where the classic freeze response is like the deer in the headlights kind of, you know, so I guess in yours it would be kangaroos with the headlights, but you know, like where they just freeze on the road. But then in humans, we have that, but then we tend to keep going. I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And then our system's physiology shuts down. It freezes to the hurt, the harm, the energy, the tears, right? All the things. And then that gets trapped inside. Where it gets trapped is still kind of a confusion, really. It's not something we can go in with a microscope and say it's in the left elbow, in that layer of skin, wrapped under the fascia. Like it is in so many different spots. So trauma, again, not so much in the event, but in the nervous system's dysregulation as a result of those events, or a lifetime, or the chronic insidious problems. Really, the word is threat, unsafety. Because some, like, for example, my classic example is if you have two people who get into the exact same car accident, right? And it's just a little fender bender. It's nothing too big. No one's hurt. No metal is broken. One person walks away from that and they're completely fine. They really are fine. Like, that's, you know, now I have to check with my insurance. More of a mental headache than physical, but they're fine. They can drive the next day, all those things. The other person, same exact car accident, exactly the same looking person, let's just say, walks away and they're a wreck. They're anxious, they're afraid to drive, they don't want to even look at a car, they get panicky when they think about driving again. Their digestion might start going off, they might get sick, they might have pain that's so chronic that doesn't match up to this tiny little accident. But what often occurs is that when you look then at their history and you look at their lives, you start to see that their cup, if we use that analogy, was already overflowing with so much stress, so much turmoil, you know, parents that weren't well, parents that were mean, parents that were never there, adoption, birth trauma, surgery, illness, but they've just been managing so well. And then it's this one little thing that kind of breaks, you know, the straw that breaks the camel's back. And you'll see people who will be seemingly fine, and a big life stressor occurs. It doesn't have to be a car accident. It could be a divorce. It could be losing a pet. It could be grad school, right? It could be something that is so hard to cope with that it just is that final straw that fractures the system. The reason why that person, let's say the person B, might get digestive troubles or immune system problems, or they'll break out in like eczema or something that's more autoimmune, is the autonomic nervous system that governs the fight, flight, and freeze also governs the digestion, the immune system, the release of cortisol, the anti-inflammation, the heart response, social connection. That's where that whole polyvagal thing comes in, right? Is someone might have been totally immersed in social activity, that person B, this happens, then all of a sudden they're afraid to see anyone. So that shows that actually that person wasn't truly regulated. They were living in what we would call a functional freeze. They would be living in what we would call an inauthentic world, where let's just say they grew up in a household of 10 kids and they were the parent, because parents were not abusing them, but they were working like 20 hours a week or a day. And so they never got to be a kid. They had to be the adult. I saw this a lot in private practice. And so they're like, well, my parents didn't hit me. I don't know why I'm so sick. It's like, but you were the parent. You were paying the bills, you were cooking, you were cleaning, you were exhausted, and you had to keep pushing, because if you didn't do it, there was no option, right? And so you see these patterns, and then this is where you get the classic fibromyalgia, chronic pain, autoimmune, Hashimoto's, all the, I just spoke with a client or a student who healed lupus after 20 plus years of not knowing why it was happening. And it was traced back to early traumas that were never addressed. But the signs were there growing up, but not in a full blown out diagnosis. So I don't know if that answers the question, Heidi. I kind of went on a little tangent.
So what it sounds like you're saying is that we've had these experiences, these traumatic experiences, and even though, now I'm an adult, the threat's seemingly gone, it's almost like my defenses stay in my body, or that response stays in my body, and that's creating tension in my body that then leads to these physical or emotional, these different ailments. Is that what you're saying?
100%.
Sort of polyvagal.
So I'll address polyvagal in a second, but you're right, Kim. And this is the one thing I forgot to mention, is the traumas aren't necessarily always what we would call shock traumas, like an accident or an abuse or an attack or a natural disaster or war. It can be that low level misattunement from a young mother, for example, who has no clue what to do with the baby. It's not that she doesn't love her baby, but she doesn't know that you're supposed to listen and feed them when they're hungry and not let them cry themselves to sleep, and all these things that we're just starting to realize are no-nos for raising a healthy human mammal, essentially. And so sometimes these traumas, this is why the word trauma isn't always the best. They're these misses, these misattunements, these misalignments in the infant's need for co-regulation. And it's that co-regulation that teaches the infant, the toddler, self-regulation. And so if that doesn't happen good enough, that little one is basically living in a state of stress. And the stress, as I mentioned a little while ago, is either this hypervigilant, tantrums, panicky, really nuisance-y, behavior-ridden kid that we see all the time now, right? It's really a dysregulated system that's seeking calm, attention, and to be listened to. Or the flip side is if they're reaching, they're grabbing, they're looking for that connection, and it's just getting dropped. The other flip side is the kid will go into a collapse. This is what happens when you leave an infant to cry themselves to sleep, is eventually they realize no one's coming, so their system goes into shutdown. And some babies will die if that happens. The orphan studies that they did, a lot of those kids that were just left there would die. And it's not because they weren't being fed. It's because they didn't have that connection, that touch. So Kim, yes, the traumas aren't happening to us. The bad stuff isn't happening to us anymore. And for some people, they are happening, but it's life to them. I'm always getting into this bad relationship. I always make the wrong decision. I'm always terrified when this happens, and they just think that's what it's like to be human.
Yeah.
But then they meet someone who has no trouble going into a restaurant, or no trouble when the milk spills on the ground, or who has a great relationship and they're not always fighting. They go, wait a second, I'm always fighting with my partner. Isn't that normal? It's like, no, that's not normal, right? Or being abused verbally, that's not normal. But if that happened to you when you were young, you just take that as that's how it is. So sometimes adults will find themselves in their lives not necessarily being traumatized, but their dysregulated physiology is putting them in a situation where they are more susceptible to bad things happening to them. Stephen Porges, who kind of popularized the polyvagal theory, one of his key coined terms is neuroception. So the perception of safety, neuroception, the perception of safety or the perception of danger. And so when our neuroceptive wiring was wired to the whole world is dangerous and no one could be trusted, but I'm going to be cool and okay, and I'm going to put armor on my body and just, like an Avenger, go out into the world and be brave. And you'll see a lot of folks who are very functioning, very successful. And then you hear, it's classic, the Tony Robbins of the world who like had these horrible childhoods, and you're like, how the heck did he build such a great business? It's like, well, it's because that was the survival, and strength was what kept him going as a child. So this concept of neuroception is interesting, because when a person finally understands, that's why I keep getting into bad relationships, or that's why I can't get rid of this tension in my neck, even though I keep doing things to relieve it, there's often a reason, and I've done the Feldenkrais, my posture is immaculate, I can move, and yet I'm still waking up in a panic, or I'm still waking up with this headache. There must be something else there. I hope I'm making sense with that.
Oh, totally.
Cool.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So what you're saying then is you're using Feldenkrais coupled with the somatic experiencing, but also Kathy Kain's work to help people. Essentially, what you're saying is to heal this response that's locked in their body.
So sort of. So yeah. So it's sort of tiered. There's layers. And if you're familiar with Norman Doidge's work, The Brain's Way of Healing and The Brain That Can Change Itself, that was the first book. In The Brain's Way of Healing, that's where he actually talks about the Feldenkrais. There's 2 chapters dedicated to Dr. Feldenkrais's work. One of the very first chapters is titled Neuroplastic Healing, or I can't remember exactly how it's titled. But when you read that chapter, Neuroplastic Healing, or the sequences of it, he even outlines what I'm about to say, which is before we do neurodifferentiation and more advanced skill-based learning, we need to have neuromodulation on board, which is essentially his way of saying regulation of the autonomic nervous system. And so what I do when I work, say, in my groups online, is we spend the first 4 weeks very heavy on theory, but very gentle practices of just, can you sense the ground? Can you see the environment and orient and take it in? Can you feel your skin, right? We connect to the joints of the body, not to manipulate, but to just examine and sense, wow, this is, again, it's hard to describe it without doing the lesson, but it's not about moving or manipulation, but it's the intention of how you tune in and feel. The way an osteopath or a craniosacral therapist, they're not manipulating, but their intention is to open up, the bones and to shift and all that kind of stuff. And so we spend a lot of time getting this neuromodulation on board first, but then I'll add in the beginning a very safe Feldenkrais exploration where a person is standing, because we know that's one of the safest ways to dive into this work is in standing, because there's a little more sympathetic activation. The muscles are on. And I teach, I'll describe it, but I'll teach a very simple lesson of a person going a little too far forward and sensing the contraction in their muscles, their quads, their feet, how their breath might change. And then I'll have them go so slow back, not so much to experience the movement, but to experience how the peripheral nervous system, so the motor responses, pick up and keep you safe, right? If you go too far forward, you're not going to fall flat on your face. So let's investigate that. And so we play with this back and forth posture so that they find that potent posture. And that's like a rendition from Moshe's What is Potent Posture in his Awareness Through Movement book. Rather than doing it from a seated chair and coming up, we're just really titrating. That's a big word that Peter Levine uses, little drops of activation so that the person can feel something is activating. My system is kicking in to protect me. And it's kind of fascinating when you get that small level of movement, but with a different questioning on board, the person starts to go, oh, I can feel my muscles contracting. And then as they come back, oh, I feel them shifting and I can breathe easier. It's easier to move my head. And so we play with that as like a first entry point into Feldenkrais's principles. It isn't an AY lesson or anything like that. It's just using the movement and the sensory perception to experiment with activation and deactivation. And what happens when someone has a stuck trauma response is they're either stuck in activation or they're stuck in collapse. And so when someone's standing, they can't collapse, right? And so we're trying to take them out of that. And then as we work through this specific curriculum that I'm talking about, we'll do, what we would classically know, coordinating the flexors and extensors. But again, not just going into it, really tuning into, can you see around you? Can you feel, kind of like the scan of the imprint? When we get deeper into the work, we will work with the kidneys, the adrenals, the gut, the brain stem, the layers of the body. And so we're laying this foundation so that with each approximation of difficulty, we're not going so difficult that a person can't stay connected. I'm here, those are my feet, this is my breath, my name's Irene, it's Tuesday, blah, 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 I'm in this room. Because when we've had bad things happen to us, this is classic, we leave the building, we dissociate, right? We float outside of our body. And I think a lot of folks in mind-body classes aren't actually in their body. And so, and I'll work with some, like, come back here. It's like, open your eyes, because you'll know, because a person will just close their eyes and they'll go off into another world and they can hear the instruction and they're doing the movement, but they're not there. And the reason you know they're not there, this is a little tip for ATM teachers, is you give a different instruction and they keep doing the first instruction. Like, okay, everyone come to sit up, and there's one person who's still rolling.
Yeah.
And then you have to, and they're like, and they really didn't hear you.
Yeah.
That's a sign that someone is not yet ready for that level of awareness, or you have to be way more titrated or have them sit up and keep getting them to say, what's it like to see your neighbor? Hello. And that's actually where the polyvagal piece comes in, which is basically the polyvagal theory isn't just about the vagus nerve, it's about a sequential orchestration of what a person does when they're under threat. So as humans, when we're under threat, usually the first instance wired in us, which is actually our more advanced physiology, is to try to connect. Don't hurt me, like hi, that kind of thing. If that doesn't work, a person will flee, or they'll try to fight. If that doesn't work, they freeze. So when you're teaching a class, you want to do the most that you can to ensure that, well, whether it's a class or a one-on-one, that the person is engaged with you and they can hear you and they know where they are. And so, again, I will never teach a class without a participant having said at least hello to one other person, if not both people on either sides. Because if they don't make social connection with Jill and Sally on each side of them, if they've had a history of being attacked or abused laying down, their system is going to be in freeze and they're not even going to know it. They'll go through the movements. They might feel nice at the end, but it hasn't actually registered in their system. And so that's where it's like, tell Sally what you had for breakfast this morning, or tell Jill where you're going after this. And then you have a little laughter that helps calm the system down, and then you go into the lesson. So it's using that polyvagal ladder, if you will, to maintain as much safety as possible through that social connection. The flip side to that, because there always is, if someone is terrified of sharing anything about themselves, then you got to have an out for that. You could say, if you don't want to say hello, have a walk over to the window and orient to the trees out there. Or maybe you start with that first, right? And you get to know your people. You get to know who just doesn't want to talk and who almost talks too much. There's those people too, right? And so that polyvagal concept is really all about how our threat response orchestrates and how we seek connection to help diffuse stress and threat. So if you think about a class setting, people are usually rushing in. If it's on Zoom, people probably are multitasking. And it's like, how can you command attention to the here and now, connection to self, the environment, and then go into the work? So I just loaded you with a lot of different theories and examples in one go. I hope that's useful.
Completely. It's
Cool.
very rich. And I think what you're giving us is an understanding of ways when we're doing an ATM, for example, that it may not be about the movement. It's just maybe it's how I feel, or just sensing into my actual body when I'm completing an ATM or on the FI table. And then if I'm instructing, I need to be aware at a different level. So we're really still looking at those Feldenkrais ideas of, awareness and attention and things
100%.
like that. Yeah, but you've just got, as you said, this other layer there.
The other layer, and what's interesting is when you really geek out with Dr. Feldenkrais's elements, he was teaching a lot of this, but it wasn't explained in the level of biology that we understand now. Like the bell hand lesson, it's not about the hand. It is and it isn't, right? It's about providing unifying tone through the whole nervous system. But I've been in classes where I'm watching a group of 30 or 40, and you might have 90% of the class who are really in that juicy, soft, and then you'll see individuals that are still doing this.
Yeah,
harsh,
strong. Yeah.
Right? And that isn't because they're not trying.
Yeah.
And if you try to fix it, their system is going to go into more threat. So this is where, as a practitioner, you have to learn how to let some things go. Because to try to fix that, they actually don't know how to do this. Because to do this softly means that they're letting their guard down.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's where you go, okay, maybe next class we're going to do something a little bigger, a little more, big limbs, so that it isn't as fine-tuned. But the bell hand is brilliant when you can get to that, because it's also turning on, all the big prefrontal cortex and that homunculus and it's also very developmental, right? I once had a woman contact me who went to a Feldenkrais class, and there was no prep, not trauma-informed in any way. It was what we would consider a very lovely flexion, extension, developmental on the side movement. And she had all these memories of childhood satanic cult abuse come in, of what occurred when she was in her developing years as an infant and being harmed. And that, for her, she didn't want to be the bad student and just get out and leave, even though she probably should have. The teacher kind of shamed her in a way of because why aren't you doing the move? She couldn't, and she left that class, not sure what occurred afterwards, but she couldn't leave her house for 2 weeks. And that's when I got the phone call, because it had triggered something so deep in her somatic physiology that doesn't have a lot of cognition. It's the felt sense of, when I was developing, this is what occurred. But my sense is, Heidi and Kim, is if that person had had some education, if they had been taken through some more structural movements that were a bit bigger, there might have been more capacity. This is that capacity, Kim, that you were asking about. So that if that flood of activation or memory were to come through, she could handle it and go, whoa, doesn't mean it's not going to be intense. And then because the teacher has established a relationship of these sorts of things can come up, as opposed to shame, like I must be really screwed up if I'm remembering these things in a class where no one's talking about it. So that can scare some people, but it's not to be scared. It's to know that humans, we have trapped so much stuff, not just our own history, but our ancestors' history. And so it's just kind of part of human life now. And I think it's just important to be really open and upfront that these things can come up, and to never say to a student, that's not possible. Or, you know, and that's where you as the practitioner, it's important to do your own work and to be robust and capable of hearing intense stuff. And for some of us, that might just not be the path, but to say, you know what, this is beyond my scope, but I really encourage you to seek out someone with this training, and you're welcome back when you're ready, and let me know, right? That kindness, that safety, that empathy, because chances are, you know, that person may have never had a practitioner actually acknowledge, you're okay. What happened to you wasn't okay. And you're okay, right? A little bit can go a long way with this stuff.
So really what you're saying there, I think I liked what you said about trauma-informed preparation. You know, I think as an ATM teacher, and, you know, we're about to graduate, and you know, really what you're saying is that in a room of, say, 20 people or 10 people who've come for ATM, the nature of the world we live in is that the majority of those people have probably had some sort of trauma. You know, it doesn't mean that they've been abused. It means, you know, various things could have happened. It could have been a dental appointment, as you said. Could have been the way somebody looked at them or spoke to them, or it could be, you know, those other things that are more severe. But that we need to be aware of that you know, we what are the things that people can do to and what you've said then is education. You've said that you know, they can at least let people know that the experiences that they might be having are normal, and that it's okay, and that they're not going to be judged, for starters. But what are some other things that people could do to do that sort of trauma-informed preparation?
So for the teacher, is that how you're asking, Kim, the practitioner?
Yes, I just had to turn that off because
my dog. That's okay.
Apologies for that.
Yeah. So I think my hope, and I was saying to both of you before we started recording, is most of my really close Feldenkrais colleagues are all now somatic experiencing trained. Now, I'm not saying that one has to become that. I have brought many people through my online courses that are not professional trainings by any means. They're for the public, but many Feldies have gone through even my lower level course, and it has given them so much information so that they can apply it into their world. And so that's really the first thing I recommend. I am a practitioner of Feldenkrais. I went this route. I've taught lots and lots and lots. And so it's very important for me to just say, if you can get a little extra education, a little extra practice, I recommend that. The other thing to mention is, when you were mentioning the different traumas, Kim, think about it this way. Where do some of our most horrific experiences happen? In the schoolroom, right? Going to school, being ridiculed. For some of us, we might have been hit. You know, I know that doesn't happen as much anymore, but certainly did in my upbringing. There was abuse in the classroom. There was bullying. You were afraid of speaking up, right? Gym class, we would call it here, gymnasium, PE, physical education, for some people was just terrifying because they were uncoordinated. And of course, you all know that a lot of that uncoordination came because these kids probably didn't crawl or roll when they were young. So even just that awareness that we're in this classroom, And you can even joke about it, like there's something good about humor where, and of course you have to find the right time, but it's like, can you think of a time when you were growing up where you absolutely never wanted to speak in class, as you bring a discussion up, and that breaking that ice can be important. But some of the main levels, and I have an article actually that I did that I'll share, that's like, I think 10 things to do to make a safe class. I can't remember.
Oh, thank you.
Well, yeah, one of them would be, when people are coming in, don't force yourself to introduce yourself. So again, this is where that polyvagal thing. Again, I'll use Jill and Sally. If Sally comes in and she goes directly to you and she wants to say hi, you say hello. And you also, some people will just talk your ear off. And so you also have to have a boundary as a teacher. It's like, oh, well, we're going to get started soon, find a place. But let's say Jill comes in and she goes to the corner. She takes, she's like this, right? Doesn't want anyone to see her. Don't try to introduce her. Maybe you just nod, or you just, hey, wave. Or you say, okay, everyone, we're going to start soon. And you just direct your energy to her, but you don't look at her, right? And so it's the same way you would with a child, the same way you would with an animal that was abused. You're not going to go up to a dog that's been abused and try to hug it right away, right? So we have to put kind of our humanity hat on. And when we're new teaching, we can be really nervous, right? We're looking at our notes. I'm going to teach this lesson. No, because they'll feel that, yes. Right? They'll feel that. And so you want to make it more of a community. It's almost like church. It's like, hello, welcome, come in. It's like, there's refreshments over there, hang up your coats. And people will see a mat and they'll instantly sit down. Yeah. And I never start a class sitting down. I'm like, all right, everyone get up, have a walk around, check out the exits, look outside. Hopefully there's windows are super important, I think, in a classroom setting. Like, can you see outside? Can you orient? The bathrooms are over there. So that is orienting people so they know where things are. That goes a long way with someone who's had developmental trauma. They know where the bathroom is. They know where their stuff can go. They know where the exit is. And they also, at some point during that class, have learned, if I need to stop and pause and get up and get a drink of water, that's okay, right? So there's like these housekeeping pieces that actually will make or break the success of a lesson or a class. So that's like how you bridge in that polyvagal, social engagement, being with the world around them. But what you do as the practitioner is, as you say that, you watch people and you see which ones do what. Yeah. And you notice the person who's kind of walking with their head down versus the person who's really interested in saying hi to people. And that gives you information as to how you might have to tweak your lesson. And that's where coming in with a scripted lesson, this is, again, thank you, Jeff. He was very good at teaching this. It's like, you might have the plan in your head of what you're going to do with a student or with a group, and then someone walks in and they're in a wheelchair. Right? Yeah. And my whole lesson was standing. Now what am I going to do? Right? And so there's something magical when you can start to perfect the before the class. And then when you get in as the practitioner, you want to be fully in your body, because if you're too in your head, they'll feel that, right? You'll go into the directives of the lesson and you'll miss that, like I said, someone just isn't getting it. And sometimes you can't cater to all the people, but you start to get the group field. And there's been instances where I've started to teach a group class and I'll be like, okay, we got to do this again. We got to start. I don't say this to them. I don't do this with my head, right? But I'm like, okay, we need to change this. But I don't just say, okay, I was wrong, we're going to do something else. You have to find a way to transition it. And now we're all going to sit up. Yeah. And we're going to do this. And we're going to try this. And then you find a way to bridge it to the first thing. But that's the art, right? That's where mastery comes in. to be comfortable changing direction based on the humans that are in front of you. It's a lot easier when it's one-on-one, because you're not having to take care, not that you're taking care of, but you're not having to keep everyone on your radar, which essentially is what you're doing when you're teaching a group class. So those are just a few things. And then of course, keep doing your own work, keep doing your own practice personally to heal your system. You know, the trainings are not meant for self-healing technically, right? They're meant for training. They're meant for learning and teaching. I think that we do a bit of a disservice by not ensuring people are more regulated going into the trainings, because a lot of my peers, and we laugh about this, are like, yeah, I wasn't present to any of that segment.
Yeah.
Like, I don't remember any of it, like what happened, and who knows what happened. But I think that a lot could be ameliorated by having a little more regulation going in. And then, you know, sometimes you can't help that, and then you just go back and you review.
Yes, exactly. I'm hearing you.
Yeah.
So you've talked about the practitioner. So now, as we just talked about, being in an ATM class, and you feel that you're emotionally triggered, or you're just going through some sort of upheaval, or wanting to walk away, wanting to run, what's your suggestion then
For the student?
My
suggestion is you need to take care of yourself. And for some people that might be even foreign, just that. So, you know, if you start to sense what we might call emotion, or if you sense a tightening, you know, a difficulty breathing, which is a common one that is representing something coming out, a heart that starts pounding, you know, we would call that anxiety or panic, but really it's the survival mechanisms, the fight, flight coming up. It's not necessarily a bad thing. That's the other thing, is a slow, gentle movement lesson, if taught well, might bring up these stored, this is the thing, if they're done well, they will bring up these things. And so this is where, as the student, also education is key, but sit up. Usually sitting up is, or roll over, or go into a position that's going to feel a little safer. It might mean that you stand up. It might mean that you walk outside and get some fresh air. You go to the bathroom, you splash some water on your face. It might mean you have to just quickly say to the instructor, I'm not feeling so well. So I think it's also good for a practitioner to have that dialogue, that contract, that if you're feeling a little funny and you don't want to scare people, but it's okay to come up and say, I think I'm done with class today, right? And you make that known to the whole class, so that when someone does leave, there isn't like, oh, they can't handle this lesson, right? So again, when that group is together and they are understanding of this, it makes it so that your comrades in the room support you leaving. They support you having some emotions come up. They support you. You know, I was just teaching a class in Brighton, the UK, almost 3 years ago now. And after one of the lessons, someone just had this rage, like so much anger. And she came up to me and I had to make a choice. Like, do I try to contain it, or do I let it rip? And I had some tools with me to squeeze and to press, because that's what I carry when I teach. And I gave it to her and she squeezed it and she just let out this roar of a scream. And the whole class kind of jumped because they weren't expecting it. And then they just kept doing their thing, right? Because most of the people in that classroom had done the previous nervous system work with me. So there was no like, oh, what's going on over there? Like, oh, right? But if anything, people were probably like, yeah, like get that scream out. And so that's one reason why I probably will never in the history of my life ever just do a Feldenkrais drop-in class where people just come in for a class and leave. I would, if I were to go back, I would only do, as I have been, day work, like day long, multi-day workshops, or a series where people have to commit to 10 weeks, 12 weeks, even 4 weeks, and that they get some prep work so that they know these things that can come up. So for the person, the student, take care. You know, nothing is broken if you start convulsing in tears when you go to put your hand to your face, for example. You know, if you start feeling like you want to vomit, that's a very common one when people have had a lot of abuse and shame put onto them. Disgust is a very common emotion, and a lot of people just think something's wrong with them, or do I have food poisoning? So those are other things, or anger. You know, there's some lessons that Moshe would teach with the snarl of the lip and showing the teeth and working with the teeth. And that's anger, right? That's that. And so it's not uncommon that after class, there might be a little more aggression in the room, a little more energy. And so that's where, you know, as the practitioner, it's like, so just, you know, be nice to your partner tonight, or just watch it. If your kids are triggering you more than normal, it might not be them. It's just that you're a little more activated because of that lesson. So that's a little bits there. Hope that is useful.
So that's, you talk a lot about building capacity. So I think in some ways, I hear what you're saying is that there's times when you go, I've finished, I can't do any more of the lesson. It's time to basically find my safe haven. But there might be other times when you're feeling, I'm ready to greet this particular emotion.
Yeah.
Is that what that differentiation is?
That's practice. And I would say that is building capacity to be with what you're feeling. A rule of thumb might be, if you're already sensing like, oh my God, I have to run and get out of here, it's possible that there were signs, somatic experiencing signs that were playing out that the person wasn't catching. And it's sort of, you know, migraine headaches, for example, or seizures. When you work with someone with, say, seizures or migraine headaches, you want to work with something called the prodromal. I don't know if you've come across this word, or the pre-prodromal. And what that is the thing that's happening before the thing happens. So if you've ever had a migraine headache, there's maybe an aura, or sound starts to go funny, or there's flashes of light. But before that, you often can teach the person, well, what is going on? There might be a tightening. There might be an emotion that's being held in, and then the system can't handle that intensity. And then that's where the prodromal, the auras, the hearing going off comes in, and then you get the headache. Same with seizures, right? You can actually I've worked with folks who have had seizures where we're looking what is going on before, and usually there's something stressful occurring that they're not noticing. And so for a class situation, again, with practice, a person starts to know when to stop sooner. And that's the other thing, is don't wait until the instructor says take a rest. From my experience, we don't give people enough time to pause in between movements. And so one movement might need 5 minutes for some people to rest, right? And to teach that is tough when we come from a world of, I have to do what the teacher is saying. So it's kind of that reprogramming of follow the leader, do the thing, and just push through it. So it's a tough one, Heidi, because it really is individual, because some people's capacity can hold that big intensity, but others, it's like the car accident example I gave a little while ago. Some people just walk away, they feel it like, okay, I'm good. And others, they go past their limit, and their system, to borrow one of Kathy Kain's words, goes kablooey. It just blows up, right? And let's just say that happens. Doesn't mean that it can't be reeled back in and containment can't happen, but you then have to say to the student, or you, the student, next time I'm going to pause before I even think I need to pause. That's the piece. If you can pause before you think you need to pause, that's going to help the system manage that stimulation of the lesson. It's the same when you're doing FI. If you're all of a sudden going, oh God, I think I might have done too much, chances are you've done too much, right? So you want to wait. It's in some ways, it can be painfully slow when you're working with, say, an individual that does have dysregulation, that has chronic pain or autoimmune, but less is always more. And it's about how they're interacting with what they're feeling, less about what they're doing per se.
Yeah.
And so it's, you know, to wrap that thought up, it really is about relearn. I mean, that's the relearning part. That's where the Feldenkrais is so good, is it's, you know, I'll never forget Jeff saying in one of our classes, you realize Feldenkrais is not about movement. And all of us were like, what? What do you mean it's not about movement? He's like, it's about learning how to learn. Feldenkrais just shows movement as the vehicle. And the beauty is it's connecting to our peripheral nervous system and it's improving things along the way. But what it's really teaching when you break it down is how to act with intention and change the intention to produce a different action that might actually open up something in the body. And that's the byproduct. And so that's the part that's beautiful, is that this, I call it sensory motor awareness, is you don't have to move very far to ask a person, what is it like to lift your arm? You know, like, not even that, just feel how you, oh gosh, is it the right or is it the left? Wow, I didn't even think about my left arm. Okay, now notice, right? And you can get so geeky with the subtlety, but then if you teach it with, are you here in the environment? Yes, my name is Irene. I'm doing this. I'm holding my breath. Why are you holding? I don't know. I'm holding my breath. Okay, now think about moving your arm with your breath there, right? And you just start to piece these things together, and you can explore so much with just the idea of moving. So
Brilliant.
It's so fun.
I know Heidi wants to wrap up, but I just want to ask a question. If I'm a practitioner or a soon-to-be practitioner, and I want to, you know, develop myself more, obviously doing your own work in this is really important. But where could I go, you know, in terms of, I know that you've got resources which we'll talk about. Is there a course or something that I can do with you or with somebody else to enhance my skills in this area?
I'm biased, but
yeah, that's okay.
You know, if a person can move through my 2 online programs, one is called the 21-day nervous system tune-up course.
Yes.
That can be started anytime. It's $300, and you have the course, and you don't have to go through it in 21 days. It's just there for you. That's the first step, and that will give a really robust educational piece. That's the 5-ish hours that I was mentioning. And then there's 9, I call them neurosensory exercises. There's a couple Feldenkrais based lessons. And then there's these more subtle awareness, connecting with the environment, connecting with the self, bridging it together. So that is like, if one can at least do that, that's a good start. And then my more robust program called Smart Body, Smart Mind, that's 12 weeks. That's obviously at a higher price point. That's $2,000. And it is like the granddaddy of online courses in the somatic worlds. We just finished the 11th round of it. So we're going to do another round in September. And that's the one that really has given people, especially practitioners, the lens of what it is to be trauma informed, but also it's about working with them. And not that I don't recommend a person, if they want to become somatic experiencing trained, then go that path, but recognize that that is not a self-healing training.
Yes.
It's a training to learn the bare bones, and they're great. That's how I started. But if I think about the amount of chaos that my system had to navigate, which was a lot, it's all in my About Me story page. If I had had personal work that was layered and titrated the way that I've created it, I think my system would have navigated the SE world a lot easier. And it's not because the teachers were bad. It's just I had no clue how much I was holding in my system due to surgeries, all the things that I was exposed to as a kid. So those two things. And then the other thing, Kim, would be, I have a YouTube channel with hundreds of videos and Q&As that are there. And then I also have drop-in classes. So that's like a small class that's 60 minutes. Some of those classes are more movement based. And if a person goes to that page, they'll be able to pick it out because they'll be like spine and this. And that would be a good way for a Feldy to sample and see how I teach still classic Feldenkraisian principles, but this layering of the nervous system basics so that there's more of a holistic experience of the entire system along with the movement. So those are the things I would recommend. And then of course, working with a somatic, a trained, skilled practitioner who has the credentials and who appears regulated. So you want to interview the people that you work with, you want to ask them questions. I did do a vlog a while ago on how to find a good somatic practitioner, so we can link that. It's like 8 or so things. If mainly you're people in Australia, actually I have quite a few good colleagues in Australia. I assisted there a little while ago for an SE training. There is an SE training in Australia called SE Australia. Ian and Tracy, I think it is, that run that. And so they have trainings all throughout the major cities. Yeah, there's lots to play with.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm going to sign up for the 21 days.
Yay.
Over to Heidi.
Let me know. I'd love to hear some feedback.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I'm so intrigued now. I'm just going to wrap it up.
We can talk for hours.
I know. I really had other questions, but it's like I need to be time aware. Okay. Oh, thank you, Irene. It's just been a really rich time. You've just taken us from your physiology world where you had your ski injury, come through and found stuff, namely Feldenkrais, and knowing that something else you needed to explore, and started your training and became a Feldenkrais practitioner. You then got deeper into the somatic experience, and you then in 2017 blended somatic experience and the Feldenkrais world to sort of develop this own nuance of your own direction. You talked to us about trauma and misattunements, that trauma is not necessarily those big T items, that there's just, mum could just not be engaged in the way that you needed her. And we talked about that we're in various states, we're basically all in various states of hypervigilance or in collapse, and we need to really educate ourselves and become more self-aware of that, and through those beautiful sort of introspective ideas that you were talking about. And then this idea of the hierarchy of social engagement, fight, flight, and then freeze on the bottom, that we can utilize when we do teach or when we are sensing our own self. So you have mentioned your amazing resources, and there is something for everyone as far as the length and the price point. So it's Irene Lyon, IRENELYON.com. And we just thank you for your time. It's been amazing.
You're welcome. Good review.
Thank you.
You're paying attention, Heidi.